When I first got my Sega Dreamcast all the way back in 1999, one of the features that immediately grabbed my attention was the VMU. It wasn't just a memory card. It had its own screen, buttons, and a D-pad, giving off some serious Game Boy vibes. I always thought its design was so cool and wished it could stand alone as a handheld console. Well, turns out a modder named Kite had the same idea, and well, he actually made that a reality with the Circuit Gem mod kit. He basically put a Raspberry Pi inside the VMU and gave it a brilliant color screen, turning it into a mini gaming console capable of emulating multiple systems. A childhood dream come true. So let's dive in and check it out. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Now, I don't know about you, but as a kid, when I got my Sega Dreamcast, I was just as fascinated by the VMU as I was with the console itself. This tiny little device wasn't just a memory card. Sega made it something truly special. It could display the time and even play other smaller supplemental games. But unfortunately, it fell short of being a true handheld. It had all the right ingredients, a small screen, a D-pad, and a few buttons. Heck, it even looked like a mini Game Boy. As a kid, I dreamed of having a console this size that I could sneak into the classroom and play. The VMU could have been that. Well, a modder named Kite Retro created a kit that makes that dream a reality. It converts the VMU into a Raspberry Pi powered emulation handheld, and honestly, he pulled it off incredibly well. So let's dive in and check it out. Alright, so in this video, I'll walk you through the kit itself and all the other components I had to source. Then I'll show you how to put it all together, highlight some of the standout features, review the pros and cons, and of course provide you with my overall thoughts. Now unfortunately, Kite stopped selling these kits a couple of years ago. However, you can still till this day get a fully assembled Circuit Gem, which I'll talk about a bit later in the video. But I still want to showcase these original kits and how they're put together because I do think this information is valuable for anyone interested, and who knows, maybe these kits will make a comeback in the future. Anyway, let's dive into the Circuit Gem kit and see what it comes with. The main component is the all-in-one board, which serves as the base for everything else, including the Raspberry Pi. It even has a built-in safe shutdown circuit to safely power the Pi Zero down. Additionally, the kit also includes a tiny 1.5-inch IPS display with a resolution of 240 by 240. Honestly, the screen is surprisingly sharp for its size, and it fits this project perfectly. And the last few items that came with the kit are the speaker and a few cables. Now, aside from the kit itself, you will need to source a few extra items. First and foremost is the Raspberry Pi Zero. I'm using the Wi-Fi version, which I highly recommend because it makes loading games quite a bit simpler. You'll obviously also need a battery. I'm using a 450 mAh lithium polymer battery with a 40-30-35 form factor. You could opt for a larger 750 mAh battery, which also fits inside the shell, but the smaller one is easier to install and should still offer plenty of playtime. And lastly, you'll need a donor VMU for the shell and buttons. Alternatively, however, you can grab one of these new replacement shells from Video Games New York. They're high quality, come in a variety of colors, and even include color matching buttons, so you can build everything from brand new parts without sacrificing an original VMU shell. But for this video, I am sticking with the original shell because I just love that classic Dreamcast logo, and unfortunately, the Games New York version doesn't come with that. So that's everything we'll be using for the Circuit Gem build. But before we dive into the assembly, let's take a moment to talk about today's sponsor, PCBWay. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order, and again a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Alright, so to start things off, we first need to extract both the front and rear shell as well as the button membrane. The VMU is a really simple device and is only held together with a few cross-point screws. Now we need to go ahead and trim the shell so we can fit all the circuit gem parts inside. I'm using my Dremel with a routing bit on a drill press kit, which makes quick work of this, and it should come out pretty clean. But you should also be able to do this with some hand tools and a lot of patience. And remember, always wear eye protection. Now this is a brass screw insert here that you definitely want to remove before continuing if you are using a Dremel. And here's what my fully trimmed rear shell looks like. Now let's go ahead and move our attention to the front shell. Now later I actually went ahead and trimmed these two posts as well as some of this section here off camera. Basically, as you're assembling the gem, you may need to do some additional trimming to get everything to fit properly. Anyway, with the trimming pretty much all done, I went ahead and installed the rear trigger button bracket, which allows me to mark off where we need to make holes for the trigger buttons themselves. After marking the shell, I went ahead and started making the holes with my craft knife since it gives me a lot of control, and later I'll come in with the drill to make them the proper size. Anyway, with the shell all prepped, let's shift our attention to the Raspberry Pi Zero. To prep it for installation, we need to desolder both the USB ports as well as the HDMI port. This is actually only required if you wanted to use a larger capacity battery, but since I may upgrade it in the future, I decided to do it anyway. To remove them, I'm just using some hot air and masked off some of the surrounding components with Kapton tape, especially if they're made of plastic. Great, now we can go ahead and prep the circuit gem board by first tinning all the pads and then mounting the Raspberry Pi Zero. Now, if we flip the board over, we have two more points to solder here, which are for connecting the micro USB port on the gem board itself to the USB data lines on the Pi Zero. Next up, we'll go ahead and install the speaker. Now, when installing the screen, it aligns itself thanks to the two upper screw posts. However, I am using some Kapton tape to help keep it from moving around during the rest of the install. Next, install the D-pad and the button membrane, and then go ahead and connect the screen to the circuit gem board. When soldering the battery to the board, you need to make sure you are not mixing up the polarity. Installing these two wires backwards will definitely destroy the circuit gem board, so definitely make sure you're taking extra caution during this step. Here you can see that I'm wiring in the rear trigger buttons using the included 3-wire cable. Now all that's left is securing the gem to the front shell and buttoning it all up. Now you will need to flash the circuit gem firmware onto a micro SD card, which can be found on Kite's GitHub page before you power on the unit. And there you have it, folks, a fully assembled circuit gem kit. This is truly a childhood dream come true. Being able to play full-fledged games in the VMU form factor is just incredible, and the way Kite made it happen is nothing short of genius. One of the coolest things about this mod is just how stealthy it is. When the console's off, you'd never suspect it's anything more than just a regular VMU. As for putting it all together, it wasn't too terribly difficult. I did have to extend the rear trigger buttons to make them more usable, but they'll do for now until I find better replacements and swap them out. We'll dive deeper into the build process in a bit, but first, let's go over the features that the circuit gem brings to the table. To start, the circuit gem functions like any other RetroPie emulation handheld, just on a much smaller scale. However, one of the standout features in my opinion is its 1.5-inch screen with a resolution of 240 by 240. Capturing it on video doesn't quite do it justice. It looks incredibly sharp in person. Even though the text, especially on 16-bit consoles, can be pretty small, it's still surprisingly legible if you have 20/20 vision. But yeah, it's tiny. And if we lift the top cover off, it reveals the micro USB port, which primarily serves as the charging port for the battery, with the red and blue LEDs indicating the charging status. You can actually load games through the USB port, but it's not as simple as plugging in a cable. You'll need a USB thumb drive formatted with a very specific folder structure and an adapter to connect it to the micro USB port. I haven't personally tried this method, but it is possible. The easier way to transfer games is over Wi-Fi. Just ensure the gem and your PC are on the same Wi-Fi network, and then type the gem's IP address into your browser, and you'll be able to access the ROMs folder to upload your games. Unfortunately, you can't just load games directly onto the micro SD card, because that would have been too easy, right? Anyway, the next feature I want to talk about is probably the coolest thing on the gem, and it's this tiny little toggle switch here. Yes, it powers the unit on, but it also activates a custom on-screen menu with some very handy functions. First up is the volume control, which you can adjust by pressing up or down on the D-pad, with the volume level being displayed on the right. Next, we have the sleep mod button functions. By pressing right on the D-pad, you can change what these two buttons do. By default, they act as start and select buttons for most games. But for consoles like the Super Nintendo, which do need an X and Y button in addition to A and B, you can toggle that mode on. You'll lose the start and select functionality while X and Y is active, but you can always switch it back when needed. And pressing the A button in the menu brings up a virtual keyboard, which is super handy for entering things like your Wi-Fi credentials. That's the only thing that I've personally used it for so far, but it's a real lifesaver, sparing you the hassle of connecting an external keyboard. Pressing the B button toggles Wi-Fi on or off, which is great for saving just a bit of battery when you're not transferring games. And finally, there are two ways to power down the gem. Pressing the sleep button performs a safe shutdown, which runs a script to properly power down and reduce the risk of data corruption on the SD card. For emergencies, like if the safe shutdown isn't working, there's an emergency shutdown which you can activate by pressing the mode button. And at the bottom of the menu, you'll find some system metrics including the battery voltage and a temperature reading, which I'm assuming is for the CPU, though I couldn't find any documentation confirming that. So really, that's everything that this little toggle switch gives you access to in the menu. Outside the menu, you also have a handy battery indicator at the top right corner, which is super useful. Now at this point, I'm sure many of you are wondering what kind of consoles are supported by the gem. I tested Game Boy and Game Boy Color, both of which work nearly flawlessly, and I also tested the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. Most Genesis games run fine with the occasional audio glitch. However, the Super Nintendo had more frequent audio issues and some noticeable frame drops. Despite these issues, the Super NES played just fine. I'd say the SNES is probably the upper bound of what the gem can handle, which is fine given its size. I did try a few Game Boy Advance titles, but unfortunately I couldn't get any to load because the gem just kept reverting back to the RetroPie menu. So I'm guessing that it's not compatible with Game Boy Advance games, which means that anything that's more powerful than that is also not compatible. In general, anything from the Atari 2600 all the way up through the Super Nintendo is supported, meaning this little guy can play a huge library of games. So while the Circuit Gem isn't an emulation powerhouse, it's more than capable of running games from a variety of classic consoles. Anyway, now it's time for that part of the video where we get into the pros and cons. Starting with the pros, the biggest one by far is simply being able to play real games on such a tiny form factor. I still can't get over it. If I could hand this to my younger self back in 1999, I might have ended up playing this way more than the actual Dreamcast. Okay, maybe not entirely true, but it definitely would have been a major distraction at school. Despite its small size, the Circuit Gem is surprisingly playable. The buttons, especially the D-pad, are incredibly responsive, and for such a compact design, it's actually pretty comfortable to hold. The rear triggers are a bit awkward to reach, but given the consoles the Gem support, I don't expect to need them all that often. However, the real centerpiece though is the screen. It's bright, sharp, and games just look fantastic on it. The size is perfect for the VMU, and it even self-aligns during installation. While it is smaller than a Game Boy Micro display, the text remains legible, provided you have good vision. As for the build itself, it's not overly complicated. The trickiest part is removing the USB and HDMI ports, but that's actually optional depending on the size of the battery you use. That step is usually needed for fitting a larger capacity battery. Shell trimming could also be a bit of a challenge, but even without a Dremel, simple hand tools could get the job done. Overall, I'd say the build is fairly accessible. However, this leads me to the cons, so let's get into those. While building one of these is relatively straightforward and quite accessible for modders with some experience, the real challenge is getting your hands on one in the first place. As of now, the DIY kits are no longer available. I bought mine way back in 2020 and it's sat on my shelf for years. Fast forward nearly 4 years, and it seems that Kite, the creator of the Circuit Gem, has completely exited the modding scene entirely. But all hope isn't lost, especially if you're still looking to get your hands on a Circuit Gem. A modder by the name of Mark, also known as Marky Pie Online, is now the sole provider offering fully assembled units through his store. So while the DIY route is no longer an option, you can still own one of these. I do hope that Kite might release the designs as open source in the future for those that want to build it themselves. But until then, it's great to see people like Marky Pie keeping it alive and available to the community. Anyway, now let's get into some of the quirks of the build. One of the first things I noticed is the boot time. It takes about a minute to power on to reach the RetroPie main screen. It's not a deal breaker by any means, but it is worth mentioning. Also, if you opted for the 450 mAh battery like I did, don't expect a ton of playtime. You'll definitely get over an hour on a full charge, which isn't great, but considering this likely isn't your primary gaming device and more of something to pass the time, it should be more than enough. And lastly, let's talk about the price. Right now, purchasing a fully assembled Circuit Gem from Marky Pie will set you back about $260. It's not cheap, but given its size, capabilities, and rarity, I do think it is a fair price. All in all, I absolutely love the Circuit Gem. It's a dream come true for anyone who's always wished the VMU was a real gaming device. And thanks to Kite's ingenuity and the dedication of modders like Marky Pie, that dream is now a reality and available to all of us. Well folks, there you have it. The Circuit Gem mod that converts the VMU into a fully playable handheld, bringing a childhood dream to life. Despite a few quirks, it's an impressive mod that packs a lot of nostalgia and fun into a tiny package. Now if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next time.